Hello, everyone. This is Darcenovia here. This is another Jedi's Cantina podcast, and for this particular one, I'm going to be doing 10 particular Star Wars novels that I'm going to recommend for beginners. And I'm not doing these based on my personal favorites. I'm doing ones based on what I would recommend for people. All these stories are standalone. None of these stories are part of a large book series. The most I'm going to recommend is trilogies, though that's not all this list is. Now, I'm not going to do this in any particular order because I'm doing this based on, okay, what would be a good standalone story for someone that's interested in checking out Legends? And if any of these books sound appealing to you, then I've done my job well. Now, the reason I'm doing this because I want to do something a little fun. I still have a Legends review I have to edit, which is going to be my longest Star Wars review. And it's still going to take me some time to get it out. So while you're waiting for a new Legends review, I'm going to be releasing a video that will be talking about various Legends novels that I recommend. Now, I've done before my favorite Legends novels. That's going to be updated, and that will be for a future podcast. I will talk about the best Legends novels and why I consider them the best Legends novels. Now, some of these novels you're going to see on the recommendation are my favorites, but I'm not recommending them for that reason. I'm recommending them because I think they're a good starting point. Now, what I recommend isn't going to be in any particular order. If you want to find something you're interested in, I'll describe what's in the novel, what it's about, and if I convince you to do even one of them, then I've done my job. Now, if you've already have read all this stuff, then this is just going to be listening to, this is what Darcenovia is recommended for people to read. Eventually, I will be doing this for Star Trek when I've read enough literary verse novels, but that's going to be, probably 2 or 3 years from now when I've read at least 100. But since I've read over 200 plus Star Wars related material, I actually think I'm more than qualified to do a video like this. So sit back. This is going to be I don't even know how long this is going to be, but let's begin. What I will not include on this list. I will not be including comics, video games, or books that are not available on Kindle. Examples. I will not recommend the Jedi Apprentice series, Young Jedi Knights, Junior Jedi Knights, or Galaxy of Fear and Jedi Prince. It's not that I don't think these books are good. I think Jedi Apprentice especially is fantastic. But the problem is accessibility. And if something is not accessible, if something isn't available digitally, I'm not going to recommend it. I might do a future video talking about piracy. Is it justified? That might be a topic worthy talking about. But that is why I'm not including any of this. I might do comics in the future, but this is only the novels. So without further ado, again, let us begin with the first of the recommendations. If you're looking for something different in Star Wars, you're looking for it to focus more on the medical side of Star Wars, where it focuses on doctors and the ugly side of war, this novel is for you. The Mid-Star Duology, I think, is a great series of books. I think these could have easily had been one novel, because I think, the story is really good. Now, what is the Mid-Star Duology? The Mid-Star Duology, think of Star Wars with MASH, and that's essentially what you have. Now, why is this a good story? Why am I recommending this? The reason I'm recommending this because it's something different in Star Wars. Because it isn't often that we get to explore a side of war in the Star Wars universe from the perspective of not soldiers, but doctors. And that is something that I actually enjoyed. It was a breath of fresh air when I was reading a bunch of Clone Wars related content. To me, when I was going through this era in my reviews, it was hell because going through TCW mixed with all this other stuff, it was overwhelming. But this was a great relief for me. Not only that, but we get to read about Barriss Offee before it was retconned and Clone Wars of her being, well, let's just not talk about what Dave Filoni did to Barriss Offee. That was complete character assassination. I think this did a good job of having her as one of the lead characters, and it was interesting to do what the EU always does. Take characters that made some brief appearances in the movies and give them some character. And I think Barriss Offee, this showed that not all Jedi need to be warriors, and it was refreshing to have Jedi do something other than fighting. And she was part of this as well. And the connections with Shadowhunter, you have a recurring character that would also become part of another series of novels, which I'll review eventually, called Coruscant Nights, and it was nice to have that recurring character. Anyway, Midstar Duology is a good standalone story, and if you're interested in exploring a different aspect of the Star Wars universe that isn't focusing on the Jedi, that isn't focusing on the soldiers, but focusing on doctors, this is for you. I highly recommend this. This is not a review at all. This is just me explaining why I think you should give this a chance if you're looking to explore a different side of the Star Wars universe. Anyway, on to the next novel, the Republic Commando books. Now, I know I'm cheating here by recommending an entire series of novels, but like the earlier recommendation, if you're looking to explore a darker side of the Star Wars universe that actually doesn't show the Republic or the Jedi in a positive light and actually brings more of a morally gray area into the Clone Wars, you cannot go wrong with Republic Commando, because at the end of the day, both the Jedi and the Sith in this era are awful. The Republic and the Separatists were both wrong. And as I was reading this era, I couldn't help but feel there is no good guy in this era at all. They're both bad. They're not fighting for anything but power. It was essentially two fascist powers fighting for control of the galaxy. And those who were caught in the middle, nobody writes the clones really as victims of a fascist government as well as Karen Traviss. Yeah, Dave Filoni did a great job humanizing the clones in TCW, but I don't think anyone but Karen Traviss did a good job showcasing how the clones were treated as property. They weren't treated as people. They were actually victims of the fascist government that the Republic was at this point. And you don't get to see that in other stories with the soldiers in the Republic Army, with the clones in general. You never saw that. The clones are just faceless. And that was intentional by George Lucas's part, to basically, the reason why they all look the same was signifying their loss of identity, how they had no identity, and exploring all these characters and deep detail, and how they had their own individual personalities, they had their own wants and desires, and the very fact even explores just how evil the cloning system was, and the Camorrans, they were evil. They practiced literal eugenics on the clones. Any clones that wasn't 100% obedient or wasn't 100% what they wanted, they just exterminated them. And these characters that we read about for 5 novels, they all narrowly survived being murdered by basically a fascist government on the planet of Kamino. And that is why I recommend reading these, because They give you a perspective on the darker side of war in the Star Wars universe, something that you would never get in other Star Wars novels. I love the X-Wing books, but the X-Wing books just don't feel as realistic and as real as the Republic Commando novels. The Republic Commando novels portray war as a dark, gritty, gruesome experience. And in one scene in the Republic Commando novels that stood out for me is when one of the clones was injured, they weren't allowed to save the clone. And the clones were actually seen as property of the Republic. I can't say any more without spoilers, but if you want a darker side of the Star Wars universe and you want to see the Republic in a darker light, or the Jedi, read these. It gives you a unique perspective, and you'll understand why I think Dave Filoni, with the clones, it was a missed opportunity not showing just how badly the Jedi and the Republic treated them in his show. He could have easily had done it. So yeah, Karen Travis did a great job portraying the clones. I think if you love the clones in the Clone Wars and you're looking for more stories about them, you cannot go wrong with the Republic Commando series. Labyrinth of Evil. Now, why am I including this novel on this list? Well, for those of you who are interested in more prequel era content, and you're looking for a good novel that bridges the gap between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, or just looking for a good novel that takes place shortly before Revenge of the Sith, you can't go wrong with Labyrinth of Evil. I'm aware that, yeah, I know there's a canon explanation about what happens during the Battle of Coruscant and what causes Anakin and Obi-Wan to come back, but I'm recommending this as Legends material for those who love the Clone Wars era and want more of it. Labyrinth of Evil does a good job of explaining what is going on right before Revenge of the Sith. And the reason why I recommend this book, and also, I just think it's a fantastic story. And it's the first of a trilogy of novels. One of them includes the Revenge of the Sith novelization called the Dark Lord Trilogy. This is a novel that gets into detail about what's currently going on with the Republic and how the Separatists are winning the Clone Wars and how someone discovered the identity of Darth Sidious. The Jedi mysteriously dies. Now, the reason why I think this novel in particular, why I recommend reading it, is for those who are fans of the prequel era and you're looking for a good Star Wars novel that leads up to Revenge of the Sith, you can't go wrong with this one. Even though Clone Wars recently with Season 7 already explains how Anakin and Obi-Wan got to Coruscant and what they were doing shortly before the Battle of Coruscant, I think this is still a good novel in its own right because it tells the story of Anakin and Obi-Wan. We get more glimpses of what they were like together, and we also get to see the political climate on Coruscant. This novel in particular was a great prequel to Revenge of the Sith. This novel was released months before the movie when it came out in 2005. Yes, it does contradict Clone Wars 2003, but it shouldn't diminish this story. Yeah, there's contradictory details regarding how General Grievous was crippled, why he's weaker in Revenge of the Sith compared to how he is in the micro series and the comics, but it still doesn't change the fact and diminish that this is a good Star Wars prequel novel that does a fantastic job leading directly to Revenge of the Sith. And if you're hungry for more Star Wars novels, this could be a way to actually make you consider reading the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, which unfortunately is not recommended in here because, well, I'm recommending stuff that isn't novelizations. Anyway, moving on to the next recommendation. Tales of the Bounty Hunters. The reason why I put this on a list of novels to recommend for beginners is it's essentially a bunch of novellas into one. There's multiple stories in here, and if you're interested in reading about another side of the Star Wars universe with the bounty hunters, you can't go wrong with this. Though Boba Fett's story does go a little bit further in the timeline, but I do feel like Boba Fett's story does stand on its own anyway. But overall, the Tales of the Bounty Hunters are a collection of short stories. It's essentially anthologies. I recommend this, especially if you don't want to read a full-fledged novel and you just want to read some stories. Like if you're interested in IG-88, Brosk, or any of the other bounty hunters that's in here, I mean, you can't go wrong with any of these stories. It's a good anthology collection, and I recommend this if you are interested in exploring this aspect of the Star Wars universe. The reason why I'm not going to spend as much time talking about this as I did the previous one, because it's an anthology and it's been years since I've read them, and the only thing I can tell you is every single story I think is good. My favorite is IG-88 story, and I'm not going to tell you unless you've read it yourself. I think this is another good starting point for if you want to get into Legends, because all these stories are short, they're not too long, and if you are hungry for more stories, there's other novels on this list that I'm going to recommend. So anyway, let's move on to the next entry. I'm going to make this brief because I've already reviewed this novel in detail last year, and I'm not going to review it a third time. Why am I putting Shatterpoint on this list? Because Shatterpoint is another one of these novels that explore war in a realistic way, and it explores the character of Mace Windu and showcases that war turns anyone into monsters. That war isn't great, it isn't glorious, it's ugly, it's evil. This novel does a great job of portraying war in that fashion, and it's the only Star Wars novel that actually gives depth to Mace Windu as a character. It's the only novel that fully explores Mace Windu's psychology, how he thinks, his morals, why he thinks the way he does. And it gives more context on his actions and Revenge of the Sith. Shatterpoint, and if you want to hear more about this novel, go to my review. Shatterpoint, I think, is a good place to start because it's a standalone novel. It stands completely on its own. And if you don't want to read another Star Wars novel after this, you cannot go wrong. It has a beginning, middle, and an end. I think Matthew Stover does a great job portraying war in a way that it isn't cartoony, it isn't glorifying war. It's a novel that showcases how ugly war truly is. That reason alone is a reason why I recommend reading this novel, especially if you're looking for something really dark, really gritty, and something that makes the Star Wars universe feel more alive and more real. And if you're a Mace Windu fan, what other reason do you have not to read this book? Moving on to the next entry. The Thrawn trilogy is pretty much a cliche recommendation when it comes to where to start regarding Legends. But I feel like I cannot do a list without the Thrawn trilogy. Now, the reason why I'm recommending this trilogy is for those who are dissatisfied with how the sequel trilogy treated the original trio. You don't particularly like the general direction that Disney is taking the post-Return of the Jedi era, and you just want to forget about that the sequel trilogy ever happened, and you don't think Mandalorian or wherever these shows are good enough. You want something more meaningful. Well, the Thrawn trilogy I recommend it because not only is it a good standalone story, it's a good story as your first and last Legends novels that you could read. Why? I think it tells a compelling story from the first novel, Heir to Empire, to the last novel, The Last Command. This could have been the only trilogy in the expanded universe, and it would have been a classic even in 2022. I think it's aged pretty well. And there's not to mention multiple ways you can experience the novel now. The trilogy now. There's the audiobooks by Mark Thompson, which are fantastic. In my opinion, I think anyone should listen to those on Audible, even if you've already read the trilogy many times. There's the comic book adaptation. I wouldn't recommend it. The Thrawn trilogy, I think, is a good place to start if you're looking to read stories with Luke, Han, and Leia along with their children and all the characters that will come after this story. The Thrawn trilogy in general is a good place to start in general for Legends, but if you're looking for post-Return of the Jedi, and this is my favorite era for Star Wars, this is where to begin. Of course, there's other good starting points, but I'm doing this because it's a 3-book series, and the reason why I don't recommend the New Jedi Order because it's 19 books, and the whole goal of this is to do no more than 3 to 4 books at a time. Anyway, I'm going to get to the next book of this list. Shadows of the Empire. Now, why am I recommending this novel? Why? Because Shadows of the Empire is one of these books that is a standalone. Another reason to recommend it. Also, it bridges the gap between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi in a way where it's episode 5.5. It feels like a Star Wars movie that could have easily been made in the 80s had George Lucas had the chance. I believe he would have made it because I think this does feel like a genuinely good book that bridges the gap between the two movies. Of course, there's the comic book adaptation and the video game, but I'm talking about the novel because on its own, it tells a good story that advances the characters of the original trilogy and shows us how Luke became Empire Strikes Back Luke to how he is in Return of the Jedi and how he learns from his failures in Cloud City. And it also gives us one of the rare occasions where Han Solo is not featured in any of these novels because you can't find that many Star Wars novels that involve the original trio that Han isn't in. Another reason I like this novel is a character, Prince Caesar, I think is a great character. I think he's a pretty cool villain, one of the coolest villains in Star Wars. Even though he's in one novel as the antagonist, he makes appearances in other novels. I know he has appeared in the new canon. But another reason I recommend Shadows of the Empire, because it's one book. If anyone who's interested in the EU but doesn't want to commit to a series and just wants a taste of it, you can't go wrong with Shadows of the Empire. It's a good story on its own. It bridges the gap between Shadows of the Empire and Return of the Jedi. And if you enjoy that, you might be interested in checking out other books on this list. But I'm recommending this book as a good alternative for those who do not want to read a trilogy. Maul Lockdown. Now, why am I recommending this book? Well, if you're a fan of Darth Maul, or you're just interested in reading about the grittier side of the Star Wars universe, and you're looking for something different, this is for you. Not only is it one of the darkest Star Wars novels, but it's also the most violent. My God, there isn't a single chapter that isn't full of action. It's also a good story that links to other stories and legends, but that's not the reason I recommend it. I recommend it because It's a good standalone story that gives us a different side of the Star Wars universe. And if you're a fan of Darth Maul and you can't get enough of him, you can't go wrong with this book. Not to mention, this novel actually shows the character with respect. And if you became a fan of Darth Maul because of the Clone Wars, well, this novel does the character justice. And also, about a thing about this novel is this novel showcases how Darth Maul, how capable he is as a fighter, and how capable he is as a tactician, and not to mention, this is a good novel. If you're looking for a Star Wars novel that is action, there isn't a signal moment that's dull in this. I'm not going to reveal what happens, but this novel also is a side story for another novel, which that novel is not required in order to understand this, considering I think this novel stands completely on its own. And I think it's just one of my favorite Star Wars novels in general. It's violent. It gives us a side of the Star Wars universe that we don't get to see. Like, how often do we get to read a Star Wars book or even a Star Wars story that actually explores prisons? I mean, Star Wars is a very diverse universe. And the fact that we actually get to read about a character being in a prison, because that's what most of this novel takes place, in a prison complex. And Darth Maul has to use his wits because he cannot depend on the Force. And I think if you're looking for that kind of story, you cannot go wrong with Maul Lockdown. If you're a Darth Maul fan, check it out. Darth Plagueis. Now, I'm pretty sure for those casual Star Wars fans who may have heard people talk about this novel over the years, the reputation of Darth Plagueis is earned. Now, does this novel require you to read other books? Because it has connections with many novels of the time that this book was published. In my opinion, as someone that read this novel before I read the stuff that it references, have no fear, this novel stands completely on its own. I think this could be enjoyed independently from the rest of the Star Wars novels that it references. Yes, if you read this novel after you've read the novels that it references, like Cloak, The Deception, Shadowhunter, and various others, you'll actually get more enjoyment. But I think if you are interested in the Star Wars Expanded Universe, that's something you could do when you read it a second time after you read those stories. And just trust me, you do not need to read any of those stories that I'm talking about. If you're looking for a good standalone novel that actually goes into deep detail about the rise of Palpatine and get a different perspective on the Phantom Menace, if you read this novel, this could change how you look at the Phantom Menace when you're watching the movie. It's like, wow, this was happening during this book? Wow. And that's the thing about Darth Plagueis that's so great. I know a lot of people that I've talked to can't see episode 1 the same way after reading this novel. And there's people who preferably follow canon I've read that don't actually care what Disney says, that considers this novel so good that it should be canon. That is something about this book. And in my opinion, it has one of the most epic moments in the history of Star Wars with Darth Sidious and his speech against Plagueis. What is that? I won't spoil it. If you're interested in learning about who Darth Plagueis is, at least until Disney does their own version of the Darth Plagueis story, this is the only origin you have for right now. I recommend checking this out. I think it's really good, especially if you're interested in exploring a side of the Star Wars universe that isn't explored that much, like the politics, the finances, and I'll get into more in detail in the next one, but the dark side, which gets into detail about the Force, metachlorians, and even alludes to Plagueis and Sidious having a hand in Anakin's creation. Now, that's the Legends explanation. I don't know what they're going to do in canon. I don't know yet, and I don't know if they actually did that in canon yet explained Anakin's origin, but it alludes to it. This novel is a good book on its own. I highly recommend this book. Anyway, I'm moving on to my final recommendation. My final recommendation is Darth Bane Path of Destruction. One reason I'm recommending this, and not the whole Darth Bane trilogy, because, in my opinion, this is the best novel of the Darth Bane trilogy, and I don't think reading the entire trilogy is necessary. If you're hungry for more after this book, then you can read them afterwards. But the reason why I'm recommending Darth Bane Path of Destruction, because I think it's a great starting point for Legends, and I'm not saying this because this was my first expanded universe novel that I've read myself. I actually think this is a good starting point because Darth Bane is an important part of Star Wars lore, and right now there isn't a explanation in canon on how Darth Bane established the rule of two and how the Sith and the final Sith Wars were destroyed, and how, or if Darth Bane orchestrated their destruction. Path of Destruction lives up to the title. And a reason I'm recommending reading this book is what I like about this novel and the Darth Bane trilogy in general, but more like this novel, is even though Darth Bane is a villain protagonist, you cannot help but root for this character when you read this novel. Even though Darth Bane is a bad guy, the villain, he has a lot of depth to him. And why I like this more than the other two is Bane, for most of this novel, is the underdog. And even though he's the villain of the story, I like reading about an underdog that beats the people that are far stronger than him. And I actually enjoyed this book. In fact, I probably listened to the audiobook of this novel more than any other. Not to mention, Darth Bane Path of Destruction is simply a well-written book. It gives us a different view of the Star Wars universe that we don't get to see. Again, we get to see the hypocrisy of the Republic in the first few chapters, because Bane works on a Patros as a slave, and then we get glimpses on what the soldiers of the Sith are like, human beings. We even get glimpses of what life is like in the Sith Academy. More than any book, this tells us multiple sides of the Star Wars universe and does it in a way where it's believable and it feels real. Yeah, Darth Bane is evil. Yeah, Darth Bane is a fascist. But you can't help but want to read about this character and root for this character, because the people that he opposes are even worse than he is. But Darth Bane Path of Destruction is unique in the aspect is there aren't that many Star Wars novels we get to read about the villains from their perspective. Nor do we get that many Star Wars novels that actually is dark and ends in a dark way. Darth Bane Path of Destruction, in my opinion, is my favorite Star Wars novel. I make that no secret. I'll get into more detail in my re-review why I love this book so much. If you're looking for a Star Wars novel that has pretty much everything on this list that I can think of, action, political drama, it has gritty and bloody side of war, it showcases a darker side of the Star Wars universe. It's everything I love about the EU in one. That's why I recommend this. And if any of this intrigues you, pick it up. Anyway, off to the conclusion of this video. Conclusion. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you was considering my choices of recommendations. I hope you actually found this podcast insightful. And for those of you who've read all these novels, what do you think? Did I give good recommendations? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What would your recommendation be for Legends novels for beginners? Anyway, next time I do a Jedi's Cantina podcast, I might actually do a lore talk video. I haven't decided what I will do yet, but I'm leaning towards probably talking about the Clone Wars. Anyway, may the Force be with you, and as always, stay safe, and remember, don't be an asshole, and just let fans enjoy what they like.